Okay, so I would like to welcome everyone this morning. We are very pleased to have Dr. Barry Jacobs present to us today on Tackling Family Caregiving Together. And a little bit of background on Dr. Jacobs. He is a clinical psychologist, family therapist, and a principal in the Health Management Associates, which is a national healthcare consulting firm. And he also is a former family caregiver, and he's provided multiple psychotherapy sessions to over 1,000 family caregivers and has provided over 700 presentations throughout his career of the last 35 years. And during Dr. Jacobs' presentation, he will be talking about working with families and kind of mapping some of those strategies out. And I just wanted to thank Dr. Jacobs again for being here and would like to welcome him today. Thank you. And thank you all for being here.
Yeah,
Okay.
thank you so
Jake.
much, Shirley, and thank you all. A couple things before we jump in. I don't like to kind of hold forth to anybody. I like this to be a conversation. We're a small group, so we can talk about anything you want to talk about, hopefully related to families. And that could be your own family, or it could be families that you're working with in your work capacity. And then, as you heard Shirley say, I've been a professional working with family caregivers for 30 plus years, but it's really been my own personal family caregiving experiences that have taught me a lot. I took care of both my mother and stepfather with dementia for consecutively for about 7 years, and I I had there were lots of family issues that came up. I have a normal family, and normal families have normal family tensions, and uh, there were times where caregiving brought out the best in people, and there were times where caregiving brought out the worst in people. And sometimes I wasn't always at my best because as a caregiver, I was working hard and I was tired and I was frustrated. So my hope is that with whatever we talk about today, that it's really toward the goal of helping families do the best they can, caring for loved ones. And so at the end of the day, maybe when the caregiving is done, that they're a stronger family for it and not a weaker family for it. And so that's what I always say. So so uh, I'm in Pennsylvania. I'm a long ways away from Texas, but I've been to Austin many times, and I love Austin. And happy to be among you today. So let me pull up my slide deck, and the slide deck is really just intended to be a jumping off point for our conversation. Um, and let me put this in slideshow mode. And so
Oh,
as you
and
can go ahead, go
excuse
right
me,
ahead, Shirley.
Dr. Jacobs, I have a question for everyone or for you. Are we able to share your presentation with everyone?
Absolutely. I mean, my
Okay. Thank
presentation
you.
is public.
Thank you.
It's yours.
Thank
Um,
you.
you're welcome. So, and by the way, Shirley and everyone here, you're welcome to call me Barry. You don't have to call me Dr. Jacobs. So as you can see here from these two identical twins, we're talking about siblings today, but we can talk about other family relationships as well. So, what I have in mind for us this morning is to talk a little bit about what we know about family caregiving in America, which is an increasing phenomenon, as we'll discuss. How caregiving brings out the best and worst in siblings, and how do we help siblings do three things? And we can talk about siblings, but we can also talk about this in terms of other family relationships. How do we develop consensus within a family about what a loved one needs and what their goals are? Because what I have found over the years, and I found in my own family, is that right from the get-go, there's not a lot of agreement. People have their own ideas about what we should be working on, what's best. And then unless you develop that consensus, it's very hard to really work in a cooperative fashion with one another. So developing that consensus is very important. How do we develop some way of communicating on an ongoing basis and having some, making decisions together, rather than one person making all the decisions and other people feeling left out of the process, which often causes some family resentment. And then how do we reduce some of the conflict that sometimes comes up during caregiving to, as I mentioned, strengthen the sibling bonds, not have them weakened by the end. So I'm hoping that this is what you have in mind for today. And I have, as you'll see, I have lots of questions for you, and I really would like this to be a conversation. And some people are comfortable unmuting and talking, and others would prefer to put things in the chat box, whatever you prefer. But I would really want to hear your thoughts. So let me start off from the beginning, and a couple questions right off the bat. And you can think about this in terms of your own family, or you can think about this in terms of a family or some families that you've worked with in your work. So two questions. One, in your family, does all the caregiving fall on one person's shoulders, or do several family members work together to meet a care receiver's needs? And what I'll tell you is that the majority of families, maybe go so far as to say the vast majority of families, most of the caregiving falls on one person's shoulders, or maybe two, but not everybody's. And then the second question related to the first question is if you are thinking of a family, or you are part of a family where several people are working together, how well do they work together on a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 is poorly and 10 is perfectly? And so if I rated my own family during caregiving, the 7 years I was a caregiver, I would probably say my family was maybe a 6, maybe a 5. There wasn't. My brother and I fought a lot about caring for my mom. My cousins were sort of in and out of the picture. Sometimes they were really people I could depend on, and other times they were really focusing on their own lives and really weren't able to contribute very much. And then they had a tendency when if they weren't really involved in something, that didn't stop them from criticizing what I was doing, and I didn't appreciate that all that much. So what, anybody have any thoughts about maybe your own family or a family you're thinking about? How did all the caregiving fall on one person's shoulders, and if it didn't, then how did it go? So anybody want to unmute or put something in the chat box? Go right ahead. I heard someone talk.
Okay, yes. If I'm unmuted, I have my disabled daughter had severe mental illness, and after a number of years, it got worse, and she was unable to live independently and moved home. And she's been in our residence in Alamo Heights, Texas, for about 25 years. And it's a home that I've lived in for 47 years. And she liked being here. But one of her 5 siblings, and on account of that one sibling, I would have to rate poor working together, although there's only one, her older sister, that works regularly with me. The others don't live with us. And but the 4 out of the 5 are cooperative with the care that we were working on her at home. But this one sibling sort of reported bad news that she wasn't getting properly cared, wasn't achieving the optimistic improvements that she expected should be reasonable and expected, and reported me to adult family services, and also the Bexar County guardianship program. And after initially leaving her at home, the Bexar County guardianship decided to, without warning, come over and seize her out of my home, and they've put her in a nursing home in San Antonio that's a 20-minute ride away. And I visited her out there every day, but we'd like to get her back home, and that's a separate problem. But the opinion that they formed was a conclusion that she wasn't receiving adequate care at home, but the tangible facts that were alleged were actually not true. There were such things as there was food, quote unquote, all over the floor, which was totally false. There just occasionally, one bite that she was being fed, part of that would fall to the floor, and it might be a little while before it got cleaned up or whatever from where she was lying on a sofa. So that's the type of thing I'm trying to deal with is what are all the standards? This is a person who was incontinent, but but she was able to get up and walk and go to the bathroom. She just wouldn't, and so we had a lot of extra issues of changing diapers and all of that, which we were doing, but maybe not fast enough to suit optimistic people outside who would come, between diaper changes and say, "Oh, she's been allowed to sit around in her excrement," which is not true, and.
Sure. So what should we call? Is it Robert or Bob or
Robert? Thank you, Robert. Yes, sir.
Robert. So Robert, first of all, my heart goes out to you. It sounds like that was quite painful to when one of your children basically reported you. I mean, that's a pretty serious thing to do, and I'm hoping that you and that child are now seeing better eye to eye. But what I'm hearing is that in the meantime, there's some legal issues that have to be addressed, but aside from the legal issues, there are family issues that have to be addressed about how do you all work together and not feel that one person is pointing fingers, but how does everybody work together to help the situation? I'm also hearing, and I'm very glad to hear that medication is making a difference now, and that perhaps your daughter is functioning better than she was previously. But I mean, I think we're going to talk a lot today about how to help family members see things through the same lens and not take opposite views and not blame one another, because that blaming one another causes tremendous hurt. It's not, no one likes to be blamed by anybody, but when people are blamed by family, the people that we trust the most, then that hurts the most. So Robert, I feel for you and glad you're here today. Thank you for sharing. Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other thoughts? I would say, let's see what we have in the chat box here. Any other thoughts about, for those of you who work in long-term care, are there, and I see something here from, I don't know if you go by Chris or Christopher, but I said, it says, I facilitate a couple care support groups. Most of the individuals expressed that they were surprised when caregiving responsibilities fell almost entirely on their shoulders, and that their siblings and relatives showed little effort to help. So let me say that I wish it weren't so, but in my experience, having done this a long time, it almost always is the case. And so why is that? And we'll talk a little bit more about that today. But the short answer is because sometimes people feel like, all right, if you're doing that work, then I don't have to. If you're doing this work, if you live close enough, then maybe this should be your work. If you're the oldest, then this is your responsibility. I mean, there's all kinds of rationales that people have, but it's really the unusual family where everybody pitches in, and too often there's that one person who's doing all the caregiving, and they feel abandoned, they feel resentful, and that has a negative impact on their relationships with their siblings in particular. So we're going to get into that a lot today. Any other thoughts about these questions before I go on to the next question? Okay, so let me go on then. And again, I'm looking for your input. How should family members tackle family caregiving together? What should they do, or what could they do to do a better job of this? Just given your own experience, when it works well, how does it work well? When it doesn't work well, how can it be improved? Any thoughts? Okay. I could be sometimes I've been known to be really mean and to call on people Socratically, and boy, do I hate to do that. But I'm just that kind of a guy, you know. When I used to teach, people would hate me for doing that. But I really do want your input. What do you think?
I think I see people, delegating different duties. Like, maybe it's like you don't be in charge of the financials and, weekends and all due days. I think there's clear lines of like responsibility that are divvied out in families so that people know their responsibilities. And it's not like an unanswered question, it gets sloppy when like there's not a discussion on who should be doing what. And typically in situations like that there's just very little communication going on in those families. It's like the caregiver, and then no one's really giving input unless there's a crisis or something.
I think you're absolutely right. Is it Chris or Christopher?
Either or. That's
all right. Your choice.
Yeah, Christopher's good.
Christopher it is. So Christopher, that's absolutely right. I mean, when families organize, when they communicate, when they divvy up roles and everybody knows what's expected of them, things work out better. And it's like any other group of people. Like if you're running a bake sale, and nobody knows who's baking what, it doesn't work out really well. But if everybody is organized and figured out who's doing what and who's going to be there on the day and help set up and help with the sales, and then things go better. And this is just like any other human endeavor where you bring people together. And there are a lot of families where, for a host of reasons, people don't talk. Sometimes they don't talk because they don't want to think about maybe some of the sad or unfortunate things that might be happening with a loved one, or they don't want to make commitments because they have other responsibilities, and so they avoid having those conversations. So they get to avoid making those commitments. But without communication, this doesn't go really well. So I appreciate your point. Any other thoughts before we go forward?
Well, I was just going to say, this is Jamie. I was just going to say that it's sort of like a one of those dreaded college group projects where one person ends up doing everything because the other people just don't show up or whatever. But I think you have to have an initial meeting and kind of figure out who's going to be the leader. And then that way, that if everybody buys in, or most of the people buy in, then that person can then start to try to delegate. Because if I just march in, I am the oldest, but if I just march in and tell my sisters, you're going to do this, it's not going to work very well. They need to decide that, okay, I am the leader, or maybe one of them is the leader. But anyway, and then I think you have to have regular check-ins.
Jamie, I think I love the analogy of the college project. That really brings back, some dreaded memories of people of feeling like getting stuck with a project, and everyone else was out, was out on the green, sunning themselves. So absolutely, and what you just said is absolutely true, that you need to have an initial organizational meeting. There has to be some leadership, and there has to be ongoing communication to really have everybody's cooperation. And so those are the kind of processes we'll be talking about today. T. Porter raised your hand. You can just jump right in.
I am, and I do apologize for being late. I do agree with both the two others just said. And as a caregiver myself, the other members have to want to participate in what's going on. It does fall on one person all of the time. Everybody else just seems like they're so busy. They have to do this, they have to do that. So that responsibility always falls on one person. So the entire family have to make that commitment to assist with, that one caregiver, to at least give them a break at the same time. It doesn't take, even 30 minutes, an hour, but they have to agree in order to make this work.
Absolutely agree with you. And what is your first name, by the way?
Tina.
Tina, very nice to meet you. Thank you for your thoughts. All righty, so that was called the warm up, and now we're gonna jump right in. But I love the thoughts that you're sharing so far. So just by way of putting this in context, there is a caregiver survey that's done in this country every 5 years. The last one was done in 2020, and in 2020, the AARP, the National Alliance for Caregiving, found that there are about 53 million Americans who in the previous year had done some amount of caregiving for, and that's a lot of people. I mean, that's about 1 out of every 5 Americans had done some caregiving, maybe a little less than 1 out of 5. Most of them, well, I should say 50% of them were caring for a parent. And then you can see from the statistics here, some of them were caring for a spouse, caring for a non-relative, caring for a grandparent, sibling, etc. But far and away, the largest group was people caring for a parent, which makes sense, right? We as adult children, we see our parents aging. We feel some sense of responsibility for them because they took good care of us. Maybe when we were kids, hopefully they took good care of us, and we want to now take good care of them. We saw them take care of their parents when they were younger, and setting that example for us. So, but as we heard Robert say before, it's not always caring for a parent. In his case, it's caring for an adult child with a serious mental illness. So lots of different types of caregiving, regardless of the type. The things that we were just talking about in terms of having some leadership, having conversation about what's needed, and hopefully divvying up some responsibilities so that it doesn't all fall on one person's shoulders. All those things hold, regardless of who's being cared for, unless you don't have family members, unless it's just you and you alone. And so there is there's a lot going on. It is in families in this country today, in Texas today. I see that Shirley put into the chat the famous words of Rosalind Carter. There are 4 kinds of people in the world: those who have been caregivers, those who are currently caregivers, those who will be caregivers, and those who will need caregivers. And I mean, that I think has been a truism for forever. And so I'll bet you that at least one of these bullet points applies to everybody on this call today. What we know about caregiving is that it does have an impact on caregivers. And those impacts are, I mean, sometimes you hear things in the news about how all those impacts are negative. And it's simply not true. I mean, it's often a mixed bag. It's negative and positive. And so the positive, and I always want to make sure we don't lose sight of this, is that if you've spent years caring for somebody who you care for, really love, it gives you an enhanced sense of purpose. And as I've heard people say over the years, they feel like they're giving back to somebody who took good care of them, say a parent who took good care of them, or they feel like they're really doing the right thing. This is the moral thing to do, to care for somebody, and that they're upholding their moral values by doing this. Or, I mean, if people have a religious persuasion, I hear many people saying that they're doing God's work in this world. They'll say, God put this task in my life path, and I'm not about to turn away from it. So I've embraced it, and I'm doing God's work in this world. Those are all very positive meanings that people are deriving from caregiving. Doesn't mean that the day-to-day care is easy, because it's almost never easy. It's always hard. But it means that when people step back and look at the larger picture, they're glad for having done this, and they feel that they've grown personally and maybe spiritually from having done this. The negative effects of caregiving on caregivers is a lot of stress. And when people are stressed out, particularly for long periods of time, then they're more likely to get burnt out, to have depression and anxiety. And this is especially true for certain types of caregivers. If you're caring for somebody with dementia, or you're caring for a spouse, or you're a military caregiver caring for one of the wounded warriors that maybe had a traumatic brain injury or an amputation or PTSD from combat in Afghanistan and Iraq, military caregivers have an awfully tough time. I would add to this, just, given that Robert's here today, that caring for someone with serious mental illness, such as bipolar disorder or schizophrenia, I mean, that too is very, very difficult caregiving. And it's not that caring for someone with cancer or Parkinson's disease is easier, because it's not, but these are often considered the most stressful ones. In addition, if you're a caregiver, you also are very familiar with a sense of loss. Maybe the person that you have, maybe a parent who you've always looked up to now is really dependent upon you. Maybe they don't have the cognitive skills that they used to have, so there's a sense of loss there. And there's often a sense of grief at the point at which that person dies. And then for many caregivers, because they're working so hard on behalf of a care recipient, they have a tendency to neglect their own health needs. So they may be going to a doctor's office several times a month for their care recipient's needs, but that caregiver is not taking care of their own diabetes, their own high blood pressure. They're not going to their own primary care visits, and consequently they have poor overall health. So they are, again, positive and negative. And what we always want to do here is, for any caregiver that in our lives, we want to help them accentuate the positive and really minimize the negative. We want to minimize their stress. We want to make sure that they do care for their own health and not neglect their health. So that's just by way of some background. Did I tell you anything that you didn't already know? Because I have a tendency to tell people things they already know. I try to do it in a nice way, but that's what psychologists do. We tell you things that you already know. But did any surprises here? Anything I said that resonated with your experience? Go ahead, Shirley.
Yes, I wanted just to make a comment on what Jamie said earlier today.
Sure.
It's about in looking at the caregiving. So, I'm a social worker, so kind of I went with them when we had to care for my mom in my caregiving role. We went with the strength-based approach. So I was the social worker, so I took care of those necessary things at the end of life. And then my sister dealt with the selling of the home and the vehicle. And so we based on strengths as to what we could best do in regards to that. And it was very effective collaboration between my family in doing that.
That's great. And it sounds like because of your background, because of your training, you were selected for a role given the skills and knowledge that you have. And that can be appropriate if it fits in with your life. If the expectation is, well, you're the social worker, you're supposed to do this, then and you feel like they're just kind of pushing it all on you, that may not be fair. When my mom needed caregiving, my brother said to me, well, you're the psychologist, this is on you, right? And I said, well, I am the psychologist, I know a little something, but that doesn't mean it should all be on me, right? That would be something we ought to discuss, rather than just you making the assumption that because I have special training that this is my responsibility. Yeah. I see Aaron says a discussion around caregiving definitely resonates with my own experiences. Thank you so much, Aaron. And let's see. And Tina says no surprises and does resonate with me as a caregiver. Thank you. Okay, good. All right, let me go on. So when we think specifically about siblings, when they have to work together to care for a parent, there are some positive things about siblings that make this easier, and there are some negative things about siblings that makes this harder. So, the positive is that they have a shared history, that they have a common parent here, that they've maybe helped other family members, or they just know one another, and hopefully they trust one another. And there are long established bonds. I mean, those are, if the sibling relationships have been good relationships, then usually they're going to be good relationships during caregiving. But the negative is almost the same as a positive. If they have the shared history, and that history hasn't been so good, maybe there's been conflict in the family before. Maybe there's been, one or more siblings have been distant from one another. Maybe they They really don't like one another very much, even though they love one another because they're family. That's going to make it harder. And then what I often see is you get various people in the family who are all very devoted to the care receiver. They all have ideas about what that care receiver needs, but they have very different ideas about how to achieve those goals. And so one person says, no, they need this, and the other person says, no, 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 they need that. And then they butt heads over what the plan should be. But that, this is, again, this all should be part of an ongoing conversation within the family to try to figure out what is best, to come up with one consensus about what the needs are and what the plan should be. So even when you agree on the needs, if you disagree in the plan, then there could very well be conflict. So here, it's just some thoughts about siblings, but I think it applies to other family members. And then, I mean, I think if you have your own siblings and you think about your own sibling relationships, you know that particularly if you're an adult, it's not the same. They're not the same relationships that you had with those siblings when you were a kid. I mean, we're all grown up now, and hopefully those relationships have improved or deepened and that they're stronger, but not always, right? Because sometimes we have siblings living in different parts of the country, and actually they may have been separated, except for maybe twice a year for holidays, or a few phone calls over the course of a year. They just don't know each other very well anymore. They haven't worked together before on something like caring for a parent. They still think of one another as the way they were as kids. And so if someone was the loud one when they were a kid, then they're still thought of the loud one as an adult. If someone was sort of the one who was very oppositional or very irresponsible, they're still thought of that way. Like our childhood reputations really follow us into adulthood, unless our siblings have experiences with us and know we're not that anymore, that we're grown up, that we have different capabilities now than we did before. But some of the old dynamics from childhood come back. And so I have a feeling that this is not going to be a surprise to anybody. So this rivalry, people feel like, well, mom always favored you, and that's why mom is listening to you and not listening to me. I mean, all those old rivalrous feelings come back to the fore often during caregiving a lot of the time. And then there are all sorts of gender dynamics, right? I've heard sons in a family say, aren't women or aren't my sisters supposed to do all the caregiving? Isn't that what women are socialized to do? And I'm a man and I've got a job and I've got my own family. I'm not supposed to do this. You're supposed to do this. Well, if there's agreement that the sisters in the family or the women in the family, that is their role, that's okay. But if the women in the family feel like, heck, why do you get off scot-free and I've got to do all this work and this is your parent too, well, then there's going to be some conflict. Or as I heard Jamie mention before, Jamie mentioned that she's the oldest among her sisters, and that if she just went ahead and told her sisters what to do, it wouldn't go so well. But birth order, a lot of people still think of the sibling dynamics in terms of birth order. They say, I'm still your big sister and know what's best. I mean, if during childhood the big sister told the little sisters what they should do, where they were going, who they were playing with that day, and almost as a co-parent, then that older sibling may still feel like they can make the decisions, or that in fact it's their responsibility to make the decisions. And it's the expectation that the younger siblings are just going to fall in line. Well, that doesn't fly real well with younger siblings who are not, they're not 7 or 8 years old anymore. They're now, in their 50s, and they expect to be treated with a certain kind of respect. So these are the sort of things I see come up with among siblings in particular that can either go well or could not go well. So I'm going to tell you a couple more things about siblings, and then I'm going to kind of get your feedback more. But there isn't a lot of research about siblings and caregiving, but the research that exists, done about 15 years ago by a Cornell sociologist by the name of Carl Pillemer. And what he found in studying sibling caregivers is that As we've been saying here, it's either one or two siblings bear the brunt of the caregiving. There could be 10 kids and two of them do the caregiving. The most common sibling to become the primary caregiver is the youngest daughter. And the next most common is the oldest daughter. And so it certainly fits with the gender dynamics. It's usually a woman, a daughter who's expected to do the caregiving. And then I think it fits with the birth order too, from this perspective. The oldest daughter often pitches in, but it's the youngest daughter who, for whatever reason, tends to be closest with a parent, may still live near that parent, close geographic proximity. So they're the one who's often tapped to do the bulk of the work. And that the other thing is that parents often have a preference as to which adult child cares for them. That parent may have always had in mind someone who's going to care for them, and that sometimes that preference is expressed. I want my youngest daughter to care for me, but a lot of times because the parent doesn't want to play favorites, they don't say it out loud, but they do have a preference, and maybe they even kind of hint at their preference. And so if the adult child who is the primary caregiver is the one that the parent prefers, well, all good. But if the adult child who the family has decided should be the one on the front line providing the care is not the one the parent prefers, well, that may not sit that well with a parent. So this is just by a little bit by way of the information from what we know from the research. But thought that would love to get your thoughts. Is there anything that I said about siblings in particular that experiences that you've had, or the sibling dynamics I'm describing, do they sound familiar to you?
Sounds very familiar to me.
Okay.
I'm the youngest daughter. There's only two, so I'm the youngest, and I am the caregiver in home.
Okay. And how are you and your older sibling doing with all this?
Well, like I said earlier, all of that responsibility falls on me. Of course, too busy. I worked 2 jobs. Even when you wasn't working 2 jobs, you still wasn't helping. But it just all falls on me. And then the other thing you did mention about not taking care of yourself is very true, because you're so focused on taking care of that the person you're taking care of, that you do not do the things you need to do for yourself. So I'm in that category right now, trying to do better, but that does happen to me quite often.
Well, appreciate your frankness, and we're rooting for you to do better, Tina. You sound like a nice person, and you sound like you're doing good work, and that it would be ashamed if you had health problems that interfered with your ability to do that work. Shirley, go ahead.
Yes, we just had one of ladies I've been working with, Dr. Zhao, is here, just joined us actually from the UT School of Social Work, and she's been doing a lot of research with caregiving. And I didn't mean to put you on the spot, Dr. Zhao, but I just thought I'd make sure that people knew you were on here, and you've been doing a lot of work in this area as well. So I just wanted to introduce you publicly, though. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm very excited to be here and learn about family dynamics.
Yeah, we're really lovely to have you here, Dr. Zhao, and really feel free to jump in with your own observations. I see something else in the chat box. Jamie says, I think I only have Shirley's email address. Okay, maybe we get your email address, Janine. So Janine is actually, Shirley is using Janine's Zoom. So Shirley, Janine. So anyway, any other thoughts about sibling dynamics? You think about your own siblings. Go ahead, Suzanne, please.
Hey there, I had a little bit of a different experience. I am the oldest daughter. I think there was an expectation. I feel like it went all the way back to my childhood that I would be the caretaker. But so I ended up taking care of my dad through about the last 12 years of his life. But my siblings, The youngest daughter had a family and I did not. So I think that actually weighs in on the somewhat of the decision making on who's going to be the caretaker. But there was also some gratitude from both my sister and my brother in terms of my willingness to step in and be that person, because I was sort of my dad's person too. So that worked out really well. But yes, I mean, and I did experience what Tina talked about of, at some point they become an all-consuming, focus for you, and some of your other peripheral things drop off in terms of taking care of yourself, for sure.
Thank you so much for your thoughts, Suzanne. I mean, what I'm hearing is that this sort of felt like it was your role, and maybe, as you said, it always was going to be your role. But I also heard you say something really important, and that is your sister and brother were really grateful for your playing that role, and that gratitude probably made you feel good. And if they were not grateful, and unfortunately, sometimes I see siblings sort of take caregivers' efforts for granted. Well, like they'll just say, "Well, you're supposed to do this," and they don't make a big deal out of it. Well, I mean, that hurts. I mean, you're making sacrifices on behalf of a common parent. They ought to acknowledge that, and so that gratitude can help you feel better about maybe some of the differences in disparities in who's doing what care.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. Any other thoughts before we go on? Okay. Alrighty. So I have a bunch of hypotheticals for you. So hypotheticals meaning this is all made up, but this is all for this is just a photograph I found on the internet. Look like a brother and sister in the middle of maybe a discussion, maybe an argument, kind of hard to tell. But I made up this family just by way of posing some questions. So we'll call them the Taylor family. And the story we'll make up is that since her father had a mild stroke several months ago, June, we'll say she's 41, has been taking care of him at her house. And her two older brothers call occasionally, but don't offer to help her with the caregiving tasks. Okay, so we got all the caregiving falling on one person's shoulders, and that is the youngest daughter. And she is tired and needs help, but she has mixed feelings about asking for the help from her brothers. So here's the first thing. June says, "Why should I have to ask my brothers for help? Dad is their father too. They should be here for him and me." So what do you think? Do you think June is right? And should she continue to expect that they'll step up and assist? Or should she ask them directly? And then why might she be afraid to ask them for help? And all of you are so polite and raising your hands, but you should just unmute and talk. So Tina, go right ahead.
So for her, and I understand this whole concept, we feel like we shouldn't have to ask because we're taking care of that parent. There's things that needs to be done. Why should I have to ask? You should be calling, you should be coming over, you should be checking, you should be calling the parent. Do you want to do this? Do you want to go do that? You shouldn't have to ask. So I don't think it's more of being afraid to ask other than why should I ask? I shouldn't have to ask. You should be right here along beside me going through this journey. So, I mean, I'm in that same boat. I don't ask. I mean, you know what I need. You know what she needs. Why should I have to ask? And y'all probably think, oh, well, because I'm dealing with all of this that you're talking about. So that's why I'm so vocal about what I'm saying, because it's so true. I shouldn't have to ask. And I won't ask.
Well, Tina, thank you for sharing that. I mean, I think there are pros and cons about asking. We'll talk a little bit more. Deborah, it looked like you had your hand up.
Oh, no, I didn't. I just kind of logged in a few minutes ago.
Okay.
But, my sister just recently started helping, And what we've kind of come up with, she lives in a suburb of a major town in Texas, but what she's started doing is once a month, she comes and gets my mother and takes her for a week. And that is a huge help.
That sounds like a fantastic
It
arrangement.
is. It is.
So,
It's
and
fabulous.
I see Tina applauding you and your sister. So that's wonderful.
Yes.
How did you work that out with her?
Well, my mother's lived with us for 5 years.
Excuse me. Yeah, mother is right. Go ahead.
Yeah. And so it's only been in probably the last 6 months that I've just told her that I have to have help. And I tore my rotator cuff. And so anyway, my sister once I asked her, she just stepped right up and she said, "What if we did it once a month?" And I said, "That would be fabulous." So yeah, so she's really come through and come and get her and takes her for a week. And my mother loves to go visit her. And I'm the oldest, my sister's the youngest. And it's working out great. It gives my husband and I a week off to relax and do our own thing. And we've been married 52 years. And so we need some just alone time, you know.
Yeah, that's great.
Technology.
Yeah,
So is it Deborah or Debbie? What do you prefer?
it's Deborah.
Deborah, and that's a great story. What I
Thanks.
heard though, and I'm gonna underline this, is you asked.
I did.
Your sister wasn't just gonna say, "Hey, how about if I take mom once a week?" You asked.
I
So
did,
sound-
but she was
sound
very accepting. Yes.
good. And by asking, you got a great result. So
Yes.
why are sometimes caregivers afraid to ask?
Are you asking me?
I'm
Well,
asking you, or I'm asking everybody. Why are
yeah,
caregivers
in
sometimes
my
afraid?
in my situation, to me, she has a great life. She didn't have any children at home. They're all grown. Her and her husband have their own thing going on. I didn't really want to interrupt the situation that she has going on.
Okay.
Mhm.
You're being kind to her is what I'm hearing.
Okay.
Yeah. Other thoughts about why sometimes caregivers are, it's like Tina says, they don't feel like they should ask. They don't feel like they should have to, but sometimes they're also afraid to ask. So why are they afraid?
Well, there's one reason is that the type of help that they might feel is appropriate is not practical, particularly in the case of a disabled person, disabled by just simply being elderly or having problems of old age, or a younger person that is severely disabled from mental illness. The idea that they might have may be unrealistic or impractical, and so asking them to help just simply opens up an argument over what should be done, and I've had that happen in my situation, particularly from the one daughter that is really at odds about that, so but as far as I wanted to make another point about perceived longevity. There's a piece of advice in the Hebrew Bible to the effect that honor your mother and father, that your life, you may live long on the earth. And uh, it seems to me that older people, as well as severely disabled, mentally ill, should be given certainly the respect due a person who is a person and who deserves to be credited with the possibility of substantial longevity. And if that can be encouraged, then people should realize that this person needs to be honored with help. I mean, to write somebody off that, oh, well, they're not going to be around for very long anyway, so why should I bother? Well, that's not, that's not, if you have family and you love them, you shouldn't ever take that attitude. And I've been fortunate because of the severity of my second daughter's illness. They've seen that and seen that so long that they're all sympathetic, and they don't have to be asked. They're all willing to help to the extent that it's feasible for them to do. Some of them don't live in San Antonio, and the youngest son is working, and so he's limited on how much he can help, but he's very willing to help. And so I've been fortunate in that way.
I'm glad to hear that, Robert. And yes, that willingness matters a lot. When people are unwilling, it often causes bad feelings. But let me answer my own question here. Why might sometimes caregivers be afraid to ask for help? Because they don't want to be told no. Because no hurts. No feels like a rejection. No feels like a slap in the face sometimes. And so they don't want, sometimes if they don't ask, then the person won't reject their request. And then they don't have to get so angry at that person. And because no, they don't really want to be angry at their siblings if they can help it. Let me give you a different scenario. My dad is old-fashioned and thinks caregiving is women's work. He trusts me and wants me, not his sons, to help take care of him. So should June, the primary caregiver, go along with her father's wishes in order to make him more comfortable? If this is his preference, then his preferences should be listened to, and that's how the caregiving should be done. Or is it okay if June wants help for herself, even if dad says he will feel embarrassed if his sons or personal care aides help take care of him? I see something in the chat box. Tina says, that's true. When you ask, they have something else to do, so you don't ask anymore. Tina, that's right. You're responding to what I was just saying before. What about this question of, should the person who's receiving care decide who's going to give them the care and how the care is going to be given? Or should the caregivers, maybe a group of caregivers, decide what works best for them, even if it may not be the preference of the person receiving care? Who should decide that?
In my opinion, we've got multiple parties here, and not everybody is going to be happy. So you need to come to, obviously, to the extent that you can, do what dad would like, that's nice, but you can't do that to your detriment or to other people's detriment. So, and I think, it depends, obviously, but that is something, some people can't be rationalized with, but to the extent that they can, I think that's something that you just have to bring up and share with them, the person who's getting cared for.
Jamie, that makes a lot of sense to me. And you can't have one person just giving up their own lives if that's what a parent wants. If the parent doesn't want them to leave the house, if the parent wants them kind of tied to their hip, it doesn't mean that the child is required to be tied to their hip. It means that that's the point of, the parent has a preference. Everybody in the family has their own perspective, has their own needs, and may have their own preferences. And so that's the basis of conversation. And as I heard you just say, if we can fulfill what the parent wants, then you do it. But if it's going to hurt somebody in the process, then maybe you got to think twice before you simply do what the parent wants. Any other thoughts about this? Does that make sense to folks, or are people just feeling like, well, if the parent wants it this way, then this is the way it should be? Christopher says, ultimately, the quality of care given to the individual in need is dependent on a motivated, healthy, and stable caregiver. So making sure the caregiver's needs are met ensures the optimal long-term care. That's absolutely right. And you started off using the word ultimately, and I'll start it off using it too. Ultimately, if the caregiver takes good care of themselves, then they'll be able to fulfill maybe what a parent wants. But if that caregiver just sacrifices themselves and doesn't go to the doctor and doesn't take care of themselves in any way, then it undermines the caregiving plan, and then the parents' wishes don't get met. So absolutely agree with you, Christopher. Any other thoughts before I go on to the next one? Okay, onward. So here our caregiver June says, I don't want to burden anybody. So nobody likes to feel like they're a pain in the neck or a burden to others. So rather than dealing with her brother's resistance to helping her, because maybe she's hinted around before and they haven't taken the hint, or they just have said that they're not available to help, June thinks she should just hunker down and do the caregiving herself. So what would you say to her about feeling like a burden, and should she ask her brothers anyway?
Definitely should ask anyway. I mean, that would fall back on myself, but
I agree.
she should ask anyway. And I mean, and be ready for whatever answer they give.
Okay, and even if they're going to be irritated with her that she's asking, even though she may feel like she's being a pain in the neck to them, she should ask anyway.
Ask. I mean, for me, I know what my answer is probably going to be, but in her case, I mean, she has two brothers. I just have one sibling. It's just her and I. So I don't have another one to go try and ask. It's just the one. So I mean, she can just try it again. And if she get the same answer, then she just got to hunker down and do what has to be done.
Okay, but she shouldn't. What I'm hearing is the first choice here should be that she's going to make the ask, even if she's going to get some attitude in response from her sibling.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. Any other thoughts? Go right ahead. I called you Janine just now. Go ahead, Charlotte.
Yeah, so something I've witnessed over time in my career as a social worker and dealing with families, regarding this issue at the time of death, mostly I'm going to reference. So there's a lot of siblings that step up to the plate when they're caring for a parent, and then you're talking about their will and what's left over. And so a lot of families are there, and they don't understand that whoever the caregiver was in the end maybe is more deserving and needs to be recognized for the care that they provided to their loved one towards the end of life. And I've seen so many fights and arguments about that. Well, just because you were here doesn't mean you deserve to get anything more than I do. So there's a lot of conflict around that issue as well at the end of life for
Oh,
a caregiver.
oh, for sure. I'm laughing, but it's not a laughing matter. I mean,
Yeah,
there can be some bitter arguments
yeah.
about inheritance, about money. I worked with a family years ago. I do see your hand up, Deborah. Just give me one. Let me tell a quick story. I saw a family where there were 7 siblings, and the youngest sibling, who happened to be the youngest daughter, had moved into the parents' house to take care of them and took care of her for years. And in return, that parent deeded her house to that youngest daughter. Well, even though that youngest daughter was doing all the work and had been doing all the work for years, her siblings went crazy that she got the house and that the house wasn't going to be divided up. They did not appreciate it, that she had made a lot of sacrifices, and that they didn't even appreciate that this was the parents' choice. Instead, they accused her of somehow manipulating the parent to give her the house, and that led to some real bitterness, as you might guess. Anyway, Deborah, you had your hand up. What are your thoughts?
Oh, just talking about asking for help. One of the things that my sister and I did was we would get the calendar out and we would go through and we would pick and write down, okay, this is the time that she could take care of. And we would put it down. So there was no getting out of the days that we had picked and she committed to.
Well, Deborah, that's a great thing. Calendars kind of lock people in. It's a way of defining commitments. Good idea. Yeah, no, I like that. Good. Okay, let me go on to we got, I think, 2 more scenarios. Oh, yes, Jamie, go right ahead, please.
But in really, really quickly, one of the things about asking is that people who see the person who's being cared for and they seem pretty good for whatever their condition is, they may not have a real understanding of all the things that the caregiver is actually doing so that the person who's being cared for is doing so well. And so I know, there's the question about what do you ask or not, but I think that sometimes people don't step up because they don't even realize really all that's going on behind the scenes because they're not there every day. And what they see is just their parent who's in, decent shape for whatever their issues are, or is in good shape for whatever their issues are. So I think that happens is that, yeah, people on the outside just don't really realize all of the effort that's being put in by a caregiver.
Absolutely agree with you, Jamie. And I think if we use Deborah's situation for an example, I'll bet her sister now taking the mom 1 week a month has a much clearer idea of mom's needs. And that maybe before she thought she knew what mom needed, but if you don't have that day-to-day experience, you really don't get it.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. 2 more. I got June says, it's easier if I just do everything myself. I don't want to bother my brothers. They have busy jobs and lives. I don't want to put myself in a position in which I'm going to feel aggravated if they say no, or if they don't provide the kind of help that I think that they need, that my dad needs. So is it just easier to do it yourself, or is it that you still try to include other people? And that also leads to 2 other questions. Are there advantages of doing it all yourself? And are there disadvantages? What are your thoughts?
Okay, I guess I'll go.
Please.
I think, well, I don't really look at it as advantages and disadvantages because for that one person that's doing that, you're still taking on all of the responsibility. And they still do not know or not concerned about all that goes into taking care of this person. Disadvantages would be it all still falls on you. You're still responsible for providing that care. So it's still going to cause you more stress, more anxiety. I mean, I don't know. It's both of them kind of play into each other. I don't really see that there's being an advantage because you're still doing everything yourself.
Yeah, I hear you, Tina, and I agree. I would say sometimes people say the advantage is that they know what's best, or it's just better to not argue. You don't have to argue with other people if you don't involve them, or they have their own ideas and their ideas are not as good. They don't understand the situation as well, so their ideas are really off base. So. And then people just feel like it's just more efficient. If it's more efficient if I do it myself, I know I'm going to get it done right. I know I'm going to do it in a timely way. If I start involving other people, everything gets more complicated, and I just don't want it to be complicated. So look, that's what they say.
Well,
but
I'd just like to point out.
Go ahead, Robert, please.
It's not actually possible for one person to do everything. Because or they shouldn't try to do. They must get help from somebody else, whether it's a sibling or some other family member or close friend or somebody. If it's only for just babysitting, while the primary caregiver has to look after their own needs, they've got to go get blood drawn for a doctor's appointment, or they have, they've got to take care of their own needs, and so they should. I mean, you can't take care of somebody if you don't look. You really actually, need to actually take care of yourself first. You won't be able to help if you don't take care of yourself.
Agreed, Robert. Absolutely. And so, but even with that, I'll tell you, there are some caregivers who basically say, whatever, I'm going to do it myself anyway. I'm not going to ask anybody. And if I don't get to go to the doctor as well, I'll be fine.
No.
And I'm hearing that you believe that you have to take care of yourself. I agree with you, that you really need other people to pitch in, and they do. I mean, really and truly, for the caregivers, the primary caregivers, self-care, other people have to pitch in. So agree.
Can I add one other thing?
Please.
Let me reiterate, I don't solely do this by myself. If it wasn't for my husband, my mother lives in home with me and my family. If it wasn't for my husband and my son that live here, I would probably be a basket case right now, because I do get that help from my husband, from my son. Not only am I a caregiver to my mother, but I'm a caregiver to my 2 young granddaughters that live in home. So I'm a double caregiver. So without that help, but that help should be coming from my sibling. That help should be coming from the grandchildren. They're grown. Any of them can volunteer 1 hour, pick up, take her to Walmart, or hey, does she have a doctor's appointment coming up? That responsibility falls on my husband to help me when I can't do it. So I'm not totally alone, but I would prefer it to come from my sibling.
Well, thank God for your husband, and thank God for the rest of your family. This is a family matter, and everybody in the family want to pitch in, and it sounds like they do. And it would be great if your sister pitched in more. But I mean, I'm glad you have people in your life, Tina, to support you and to actually give you the time that you need to do the things for yourself that you need to do. And I'm glad that they're there. So good for you, and glad that you either they know to just step up without you're having to ask, or you're asking them. But I'm glad they're there for you. I'm a little concerned about the time, so I'm going to kind of forge ahead. And the last little scenario here is part of me thinks that I should be doing even more for Dad. If others help me and I do less, then the guilt is going to eat at me. And what I'm going to just say about this one is there are caregivers who feel that if someone else helps in any way, that that it means that they're falling down on the job, and they feel guilty. Now, I don't agree with them, but I understand that people feel that way. So when it comes to June feels this way in our little case example here, the answer is no, she shouldn't feel guilty, and that if she does feel guilty, then we would say to June some of the things I've heard you folks say, and that is, if she doesn't take care of herself, then she's not going to be able to continue taking care of her dad forever and ever. And that if she wants to take care of her dad, and she feels that it's her responsibility to take care of her dad, then she has to allow other people to pitch in, just as Robert was saying. So I think we've answered this question. I want to kind of talk a little bit about this 3-part process. That none of this is going to be surprising, given everything we've been saying. But in order for siblings or any group of family members to work well together, there are a few things that have to happen. So one of them is there really needs to be some, not perfect agreement, but basic, rough agreement about what the care receiver's condition is, what their needs are, and what's likely to happen over time. Because, for instance, a lot of times I see within families that are just beginning to deal with an older adult who has dementia, one family member will say, look, they're developing dementia, and other family members will say, what are you talking about? He's fine. You're making a big deal out of nothing, or you're trying to take over their life. And then that often leads to conflict right at the beginning about what's going on. It helps when family members agree on what's going on and what needs to be done. And I spend a lot of time when I work with sibling groups or other family groups just focusing on developing consensus, because if they don't all believe the same thing, they're not going to be able to pull together. So I talk a lot about how everybody in the family needs to receive the same information, receive whatever available medical notes there are, whatever maybe everybody needs to meet with the primary care provider or other healthcare provider that's involved to talk about what may be going on. I want to make sure that everyone in the family is working from the same set of information. They may reach different conclusions, but over time, as more information comes in and that information continues to be shared, what happens is that the different viewpoints within a family tend to get closer. People begin to see the situation from the same lens, even if they're not, as I said, if they're not in perfect agreement. So that's step one. Step two is that once there's basic consensus about what's going on and what needs to be done, then, as I think Jamie pointed out earlier, then you're willing to sit, then everybody's going to sit down and have a conversation about three things. What is everybody willing to do? Each person's willing to do? What are they able to do? Not everybody's able to do the same things. When my stepfather had dementia, he fell down a lot. He had very poor balance. My mother couldn't pick him up, right? So she wasn't able to do the physical task of picking him up. She had to get someone else to pick him up when he fell. That meant she got someone else in the family to pick him up, and that would be me a lot of the time, or she was calling the fire department to pick him up, right? And after a while, the fire department doesn't want to get another call to go out and have to pick somebody up who fell. So my mother wasn't, as much as she would have wanted to pick up my stepfather from the ground whenever he fell on the carpet, she couldn't do it. And then the third thing was available. We've already talked about how sometimes people have multiple jobs. Sometimes people have other family responsibilities. They're not always available. But everyone has to define in a meeting, maybe an initial organizational meeting, what are they willing, able, and available to do? And that the idea here is for the group of people who care about the person who has an illness or age-related disability, that we want to have these folks work together. And working together doesn't mean that everyone's going to do the equal amount. We've already agreed that it almost always falls on one or two people's shoulders. But everybody, what I say to groups of family members is everyone is expected to pitch in some form or fashion. So I love this illustration. Maybe it's a photograph on the left here, because what I like to say is in caregiving, like in many family endeavors or like many group endeavors, there are big gears and there are small gears. So the big gears are going to be your primary caregivers, and then there's other people who are going to play smaller roles and just do less. And that caregiving requires that there be big gears and small gears. But everyone has to, in my mind, everyone has to be a gear of some sort or another, and those gears need to mesh well together in order for this to be, a smoothly working operation. And that and I'll just say, just to say parenthetically here, that if somebody in the family doesn't want to, they're not willing to pitch in, they say they're not able, they say they're not available, and that may be true, but they're letting down the other people in the family. And I have actually said to family members, you can say, I'm asking you to do this for me, not for our parent. I'm asking you to do this for me, not for, the person we're all caring for, because this is personal. This really is personal. People remember who was there in mom's hour of need and who was not. And the people who weren't there, oftentimes there's still negative feeling toward them long after a parent dies. And so everyone needs to understand the stakes are high here. Everybody's observing who's doing what. Everybody's observing who's pitching in and who's not. And in my mind, everybody should pitch in some form or fashion. So I'm going through this very quickly because I want to make sure we have time to go to just talk in general. But I just kind of go to the third part of this, and that is, and again, Jamie, you said this right at the get-go, there has to be ongoing communication. There has to be a way that people are sharing information. Maybe they're having formal meetings, and I like it when you have a kind of a powwow every 3 months or so, and you sit down and you say, okay, here's how things are going. Here's what the needs are. My ability to or availability is changing. Can someone else step up? But you're beginning every quarter or so, you're going to revise the caregiving plan that will take into account all the participants' needs, all the caregiving team members' needs, and those needs change. And that when you have a group of family members, even if they're big gears and small gears, even if there's one gigantic gear and then a bunch of tiny gears, then you still, when people are talking together, when they're working together, and they're feeling like there's a level of cooperation among them, and they're all looking out for one another. They're looking out for the person they're caring for, but they're also taking into account each other's needs. Then you have this good feeling afterwards. Then you have, as we say that we want to strengthen the family bonds. When people feel like that the person that they're working with has been considerate for them, it's been someone who they learn that they can trust them more, that they're reliable. That's much better than weakening the bonds. When people feel that they were betrayed by another family member, or they feel that that person fell down, didn't come through, and they say they wouldn't have come through, or absolutely just failed them. And when family members feel like they do come through for one another, even if there's not equal participation and equal contribution, just feeling like you were there for me when I needed you to be there for me, that matters. That helps strengthen that relationship forever after. So I just did a lot of talking really fast. I'm going to kind of go back to this plan here. This is a summary of the plan. And anybody have any thoughts about this? Does this make sense? Is this how it works in your family, or could you imagine that this might work or not work in your family? I know I just threw a lot at you, and I just see, and thank you, Shirley, for your thoughts. Any other thoughts here? But would something like this work? This idea of let's all get together and figure out what's going on and what needs to be done and who's going to do it.
Yeah. It's difficult. This item one of consensus about a parent's diagnosis, or in my case, the siblings' diagnosis, because with severe mental illness, then what is the possibility of recovery? That's just a big open question. You want to be optimistic and think that, well, yes, there's some degree, and there could be vast disagreements over what recovery is possible. Somebody who's disabled is disabled. I mean, for instance, you can't engage in occupational therapy with somebody who's disabled, from actually practicing some occupation. But there are other things, to enable them to take care of themselves a little better, which they're not doing anything to take care of themselves other than feeding themselves with food that's presented to them, for example, and resting and sleeping and maybe getting up to help themselves to a cup of coffee, But that is difficult. That's a difficult thing. It's and the degree of disability of an aging parent, that's hard to do. And I can certainly see the issue of wanting to defend somebody's independence as much as possible.
Agree with everything you just said, Robert. And so everything you just said is part of a conversation, right? That the family has to have that communication to kind of sort all this out.
Yeah, and meeting together and reporting the latest developments, that's good. You can still have disagreements over over how to interpret stuff. If you have a mentally ill person that even as they begin to recover and begin to converse a little better and have a little bit of a conversation, there's still the word salad problem, where there's just sort of things that don't make sense that are sprinkled in, or irrelevant things that the attempted conversation breaks off, So it's anyway. Thank you. And I knew I was an outlier in this, that my situation was going to be atypical of what the focus of your thing was, but I was glad to see that there 6% of caregivers have to deal with adult children, and that's a particularly poignant thing. You've had to go through the disillusionment and disappointment that this person that seemed to have such promise at one stage all of a sudden doesn't, and it takes years to get accept that, and but when you see the long term, mental illness is a special situation because it affects younger people, and so you're in for a long haul. A long haul.
I hear you, Robin, and what you called about this disillusionment. I think of grief. I've worked with many parents who grieve the loss of the dream that they had for their child,
Absolutely.
and it is a long haul. And I mean, what I'm hoping is that some of the things that we talked about today, the really having people pitch in, having them cooperate, having them talking, not always agreeing, but having consideration for one another, giving to one another, feeling like this is a family, that people are pulling together, they're not pulling apart. Those things matter, regardless of who you're caring for or regardless of what your family situation is. And so, I hope that we talked about some things today that are pertinent to you and your situation.
Thank you. Yes.
We have 5 minutes left. I know Shirley's going to need a couple minutes just to wrap up at the end, but I'm going to take down the slide deck and just see anybody have any thoughts or anybody want to talk about anything that we haven't talked about so far regarding families. I could talk about families from here to tomorrow.
I had one on one of the slides there that you were covering about, like going to the sibling and being direct about their lack of involvement, how it affects you personally, like asking from a personal standpoint, and how that can have long-term impacts on the relationship between those siblings. Like, I'd like you to maybe recall scenarios in your clinical experience where like someone really just like, is it effective to paint that line, in the sand where it's like, look, if you don't chip in for me right now, this is permanently going to sever our relationship or cause that sort of thing. Is that going to cause more issues or less issues? And have you experienced cases of that?
I mean, Christopher, it's a judgment. So I'll give my own situation. There were a lot of circumstances around why my mother needed care, and some of it was that she had mismanaged her money and she had done things where she had made some very bad decisions. And I went to my brother, and he basically said, "Well, she screwed up. This is on her. She's going to have to deal with the consequences of this." And I said, "That's not right. We're her children. We're supposed to step up." And I said, so what I said to him was, "This is not about mom. This is about, I need you to step up and do more because I had been caring for our mother for a long time. I need you to do this for me." And I didn't give him an ultimatum. I didn't say, "If you don't do this for me, I'm going to sever my relationship with you." But I made it plain that this wasn't about mom. This was about how, what kind of a relationship we were going to have in the future. Were we going to be able to really rely on one another? Were we going to be there for one another when we needed one another? And I was saying to him, "I need you now. Can you be there for me?" And I would, to his credit, he wasn't immediately receptive, but then over time he stepped up and did more. And I don't think he just did it for me. I think he did it for our mother too. But he also, it was plain to him that this was going to damage our relationship, and he didn't want a relationship to be damaged. So is it a risk? Yeah. Was I saying to him what was the truth? And that is, if you didn't help me, I was going to resent you. I was going to resent him if he didn't help. And so I was just put into words what was really evident. And he responded because he did and does want a relationship with me. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. I think it's a real like nuanced thing. I think in most scenarios like that, there's a great deal of emphasis that needs to be put on tone and wording. And you can get yourself in a lot of trouble with ultimatums, and you can actually dig yourself a bit of a hole in terms of like people digging into their positions and going, well, you know, if it's gonna be like that, then we're gonna sever 100% right here. And, you know, like it can make things, you know, escalate. It would be nice almost if there's a well-developed script, you know, the caregiver script for asking for help. Like, you know, like, because I've had to, you know, I come from like healthcare management sort of side. So I will rewrite an email, you know, like 20 times to make sure like the tone is correct. And often a little bit of sugar goes further than, you know, vinegar. But sometimes the vinegar is what comes out, you know, the first run. So I think like to have like a script where like caregivers can go, okay, this would be the optimal way to say this is meaningful to me, but like make sure there's a bridge for that person to walk down gracefully.
I think that's really well said. And you know, I have an article I've written about this from years ago, which I'll send to Shirley, and she can distribute it along with this deck.
That would be great. Yeah.
Yeah, and thank you, Tina, for your comments. I want to turn this back over to Shirley to wind us down here.
Yeah, I'm gonna stop recording now. Thank you.